Hello, everyone, and welcome. So far in our podcast, we have covered all the sculpting tools. We've sculpted a hand. We have then used the bake sculpt in order to create normal and displacement maps for the hand, as well as have some simple low polygon topology to work with for rigging. So now we are going to rig this hand. This hand will be a sculpture for a library, and I'm thinking of having something like this where it looks like the hand is pushing one of the bookshelves, and at the same time it's creating a nice reading nook. The idea behind it is that knowledge leads the hand, so when you learn something, it helps you create and do and take action, and that can look like many different things. It can look like learning how to sculpt inside of Cinema 4D now, or it could look like something else. But that's what I'm going for here. Let's go ahead and get started. So here is our hand. You can see what it looks like as it's rendering. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the old versions in this layer. So you can see I'm in Cinema 4D, and this is our layers here. They're right next to our attributes manager when we're in the standard mode. I'm just going to grab these and put them in here, and grab this and put this in here because these are the older versions. And if I click this button here, it has an M over it for manager. If I click that, they'll disappear from my object manager and things just look a lot neater. I don't need them to render. I don't need to see them in my viewport, so I'm turning off those as well. This is our hand that we've 3D modeled. I know I mentioned that I wanted it to be metallic, and then I changed my mind because I kind of like this matte look to it. I'm going to turn off the redshift sky and just turn off the renderer. You can see that I have this within a subdivision surface with the subdivision cranked up to 4, but this is what it looks like on 0 when we take away those subdivisions. If you want to learn more about the subdivision surface, I covered that previously as well, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. We created this material last time, so that's where we're getting those nice fine details. When we were rendering before, it's from the displacement and normal maps we had created in the last episode. But today, we need to take this a step further, and that means we need to rig this. I'm going to close out of here, and let's talk a little bit about where you can find your rigging tools. So you can find them under the character menu here. You'll see these dots at the top. If you click them, you can detach this menu and just drag it over to wherever you want. I'll add this over here. I think it'd be easier to start off in the top view, so I'm hitting the middle mouse button to see all 4 views, and then I'll hit the middle mouse button again in the top view, so we're just looking here. You'll see we have this option here called the joint tool, and joints are a way to control how your hand or your character or any rigged object will eventually be able to move. So you place them where you'd think joints would go, thus the name, and that creates a point in space there where it adds an axis that will be used to control how an object bends and moves, how your mesh bends and moves. So what I'll do is I'll just start off in the top view, and I'll add in a joint here at the starting point. And you do that by holding Control and clicking, and then you'll see we have our first joint. I'll hold Control and I'll click up here about where I want the wrist to start moving. And now we have these 2 points here. You can see that I accidentally started these joints within the subdivision surface. So I'm actually going to move these out of the subdivision surface. I'll just start naming these. Hand. And the reason why we are rigging this is so that we can more easily change the position of it and use it for multiple purposes. Now this joint, we can call this the elbow. And this joint up here, we can call this the wrist. Sometimes what I like to do is Google hand anatomy, and you'll just get some general pictures. Like this one's good because it shows all the different bones in here. I'll open this one. So this is a pretty nice illustration here. I like being able to see the bones in the hand because it helps me think of where I'm actually adding the bones or joints inside of Cinema 4D. Different software calls this different things, and here they're called joints. In other software, sometimes they call these bones. It's really important to name them so we don't get confused later. A lot of people, when they're rigging hands, they won't add in this part here, the metacarpals, because you don't often see them move very much, and they aren't really necessary if you're doing a cartoony character, but they do have some movement. If you look at your hand, you can see that if you put your pinky and your thumb together, your metacarpals actually move a little bit. And that's how your hand's able to wrap around. It's not just your fingers that move. Your metacarpals move as well. So I think in this case it makes sense to add it just so that we have that option of extra movement in the hand. A lot of people do not add that, but I will. And I really like how they name the different bones in here, and I've seen bones be called joint 1, joint 2, joint 3 for the pinky and such. And sometimes that's okay, but I found that if I do that, I get really confused. So I like to actually sometimes name things by their medical terms, and I think most artists don't do that. So that's our first joint here. And then this would be our proximal joint. Middle and distal. So that's about the locations. And you can see that this is outside of the hand. So something that I just like to show you quickly, if we change perspectives here, and I'll line this up correct later, but you can see that when you rotate one of these, the other joints in front of it within the hierarchy follow it. The other finger joints move as well. That's just important to recognize. Each one has its own axis, and within the hierarchy, the other ones are controlled by the one above its axis, and you can create additional movement in here. And that's basically how one of these works when it comes to rigging. It's very similar to how a person moves. One joint follows the other, which follows the other. Everything works as a unit, as a system. So that's what we're doing here. And right now you'll notice that our pinky finger here is not connected to the wrist joint. It's just moving on its own. You know, we could put that anywhere. If we move this, the other one is not following. So if we want this to follow this, what you can do is just drop this in here, and now it's in the hierarchy. And since this has a null underneath the wrist, it's not going to create a joint from here to here. It's not going to show that green bone like we see between these two joints. This one is separate. Now, I'm going to name this pinky, and this one will be our pinky metacarpal. Pinky proximal. So I just named these pinky metacarpal, proximal, middle, distal. And this one we'll call the end. So this joint is mostly here for aesthetic purposes so that we can see the one beforehand, but this won't really be used too much to control anything. So I'll name this pinky end to just be a little bit more specific. But just by adding this extra one at the end, it helps us visualize this joint a little bit easier. So now, since I'm a little bit lazy when it comes to this and I want to make my life easier, I'm going to hold Control and drag this over so we make a copy. Now you can see this one says pinky 1, but this is not a pinky. We're going to use it for this finger here. So we're going to need to change the naming actually a little bit. And I also would like to move these joints individually. I can rotate this a little bit. If you select a joint in here and you hold down the 7 key, very, very important hotkey, it allows you to move this joint independently from the other joints. So then that way you can move these without moving everything else within the hierarchy if you'd like to. I find this really helpful, and it's easy to forget that 7 hotkey is important. So this is the second part of our hand. I don't want to spend a bunch of time renaming these. So this is our ring finger, and we're going to use the Shift-C button to bring up the commander. And once we do that, we're going to look for our naming tool. So I just typed in naming, and you can see our naming tool came up. And here, this is a really helpful tool. We can replace everywhere where this says pinky by typing this in with ring so that we know this is the ring finger. And I'll press replace name. Now you can see everything automatically updated to ring. So that saves us a lot of time of typing. Really helpful tool to be aware of. I'll get rid of this that says 0.1. We don't need it to say that. We're going to need another finger, so I'm going to go ahead and hold down Control so that I can duplicate this here. And I'm going to rotate this just a little bit. And I'm going to start moving each joint into place. I'm holding down the 7 key, and I'm just going to move this up a little bit. Right there looks good. So pretty quick and easy. We have 3 fingers set. I need to click on all of these. We're going to place the names. It looks like I missed this one when I was renaming before. I must have not selected everything. Oh, I see what happened. So I had a typo in here, so it didn't change the name there. So that's something to be careful of, is if you have a typo, it won't know that you want to replace the name. I'll just change this one manually. This is going to be the middle, and I'm going to select all of these, find our naming tool again, and I'm going to replace ring with middle. And then I'll click replace name, and then we should be in a good place. So you should be getting an idea of the pattern here. I'm going to move this over. I don't like how this is twisted, so I'm going to hold the rotate. I'm going to press rotate and hold the 7 key in order to get this aligned again. This is actually really important to make sure that your joints are aligned for them to look right and move right. Could talk about that a little bit more later. I'm going to hold down Control again, and I'm going to duplicate this. The metacarpal looks like it's in a good place. I'm going to hold down 7, and I'm going to move this. I'm going to check on this here, move it into place. And this I'm just checking from the top view. We will check it from the side in a little bit. I find it's just easier to work with one axis at a time, and then switching back and forth between the two. So we're almost there with the joints, and now we just need to add one for the thumb. And the thumb is a little bit different when you think of the shape. I'm going to grab the joint tool again. I'm holding Control, I'm clicking again, since that's about where the thumb would move. We have another joint up here. This is your middle joint for your thumb. They actually call this your proximal. The thumb doesn't have a middle joint. And then we have the distal up here. So the thumb's a little bit different. You can see it here. We have the metacarpal, proximal, and then we skip the middle. We just have the distal here. This we simplified down as just calling it the wrist. So this is the basis for our joints. I need to go ahead and move this since it looks like we accidentally added the root to the middle joint and we don't want that there. So we're going to need to move these and correct them a little bit. This is our middle joint. This is actually supposed to be our pointer finger. You could once again use the naming tool again to name these. From being middle to pointer, but the problem that I run into sometimes with that is that one of the joints is called middle, so when it's just easier for me to type it in here, I feel. I'll make that the pointer, and I'll make this the pointer as well. This is our thumb. Thumb metacarpal. You can see how I set up the hierarchy here and named everything, and how I have these nulls in place here. And that makes it so that when we move this, everything moves with it, which is great. And we can even have this bend at the wrist. Everything is moving nicely. We can have the finger bend. All good signs. I'm going to undo a few times and just put this back in place. And now we need to make sure that this lines up this direction. So I'll go into our right view and zoom in here. I'll go ahead and move this on up here. I try to make the joints as centered as possible because they look more correct when the geometry follows it. And the way we'll have the geometry following it is a method called weighting. And we're going to talk about what weighting is and weighting the geometry. For right now, just realize that this will help the geometry follow the joints more cleanly later if we place the joints in the center. I've made the mistake in the past of not placing these perfectly in the center. When I've done that, it's caused some weird deformations while animating. So I've learned from experience that this is a much better way of doing it. Sometimes the best way to learn is also the hardest way to learn. But hopefully, just by going through this together, it'll save you some hard lessons later. We're all learning. I'm still learning, and it's a part of the process. Let's go ahead and lower these so that they're a little bit more centered so that they move nicely. I just clicked on all the proximals, all the proximal joints. That sounds more correct. All the proximal joints and moved them together as a group. Now I'm looking at the middle joints of the fingers. We'll worry about the thumb in a little bit. Right now I'm focusing on the fingers. And you'll see this is much harder to see what's happening. So I'm actually going to go into the perspective view here so that I can see what I'm clicking on and to see how well these are all lining up. And I may move these individually just because I think it'll be a little bit easier. So let's take a look at the pinky over here. If it helps you, something you can do is you can click on your mesh and you can change it to X-ray mode, and that will make it see-through. Now you can see our joints through it a little bit easier. Another option that you can do if you don't want to accidentally click on this is you can go into your programming tags and you can select interaction, and you can disable viewport selection so you can't accidentally click this anymore. Another option for making this so that it's harder to click on by accident is actually using your layers. So you can add a layer in here and name this geometry of rigs. And once you do that, you can drop this within here, and you can make it so that it's locked and it's no longer something you can click on if you want. So there's different ways you can do that. It's good to know your options. Makes it a little bit easier to work when you know what you can do, or when you're opening up another artist's file, so you can figure out what their thought process was and what their method was if you know the different possibilities of what they could be doing or using. I'm going to lower this a little bit. That's our proximal joint. We have our pinky middle joint. I'm going to line up all of these in the center and probably speed this up to save you some time, and we'll meet back here. Here we are, we have our joints set up in our hand. Now what we need to do is create controls so that they're easier to move while we're adjusting the hand, because sometimes it can be hard to click through an object, as we talked about. So controls really help make it easier to animate or to position an object. In this case, we're just positioning it for sculptures. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can do that. We actually need to position our controls very similar to how we've set up the hierarchy for the joints themselves. Another really helpful tool to have is to use enable snap, because you can actually snap to axes. There we go. It's very useful to click on the axes, and we've covered the snap settings before. If you're interested in that episode, it's within the podcast. You can just search for snap and you'll find it in there. Perhaps since a lot of these joints can rotate, maybe a circle would make sense for the fingers here. I'll also just use a circle for the base of our hand. You can adjust the radius in here. I'll go over how to scale something after you've rigged it as well, but sometimes it's easier to scale everything together. And I'm just going to drop in a cube here. to get an idea on scale. You can also drop in order to help you get an idea of scale, you can drop in a figure here. So we can see that our hand is quite a bit smaller than this figure. So I think it makes sense in this stage to actually scale this up. I think it's possible that when I copied and pasted this hand from one scene to another, the units had changed, so it changed the scale. So that's something to be aware of, is to check your scale if you copy and paste something into a new file. Sometimes you'll run into this. So you could see that I ran into it here. Originally, this hand was a lot closer to scale, and it looked correct before. In the last episode, I did change where we were dropping this into and dropped it into a new file with different units. I'm going to rotate this character around and use him to get an idea of how big we should make this hand. I'm turning off that this is locked here, and I'm going to group these together as hand so that we can scale them both together. We've talked about the different modes. Model mode is great for when you're 3D modeling. Object mode is better for scaling things with generators or that are rigged. So I'm going to actually switch over to object, and I'm going to press the T hotkey and try scaling up. And you can see that this is scaling up just fine, except that we are not scaling from the center of it. So we'll enable axis. You can also do that with the L hotkey. And I'm just going to move this over. And as we talked about before, we can snap this to the axis of this joint if we want to move it from that point. You can see we are snapping to the axis there. Now we'll make sure that it also lines up in this view. Snap to the axis. And then once we're done moving the axis, we can turn that off. And scale this up here. I'm lining this up in the top view because I think that's a little bit easier to see. For right now, I'm just making it to scale here, but I will probably also make a giant statue out of this hand, which will be larger than this figurine that we dropped in here. I'm going to turn this off for right now, but this at least gets it a little bit closer. And then if I want to just center this in general, I can go ahead and type in 0 for the coordinates. And we're back in the center. Let's go ahead and continue forward. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I troubleshoot that, because things happen, and it's important to me that I not only show the steps as if everything was going perfectly all the time, but I show also how to fix problems as they come up even for me, or if I forget a step, how to fix it then. That's just as important to know how to fix things when they go wrong as to know how to do the steps when everything's going right. In fact, sometimes it's more important to know how to fix things when they go wrong. So right now we have this here, and I'm going to call this elbow. And this would be our control within our elbow. So I'll add this in here, and this would be called wrist. I'm checking in both perspectives to make sure these line up. I'm going to line this up with the pinky joint. And I'm actually going to make this editable. This control here. Once I feel this is lined up. And there's a reason for that. I'll show you in just a moment. So in this case, I don't think that this shape or of control makes it easy to actually adjust this here. So I think that what makes a lot more sense is to hit the C hotkey or this button here, and that'll allow us to go back into model mode and just click on the individual points of this while keeping the axis in the same place. We can move the spline without moving its axis. And why that's useful is we can just position this over the metacarpals. I'm holding shift to rotate this 90 degrees. And then I'll rotate it this way to show that this lines up with this joint here. And then I can use these in order to shape this further. So I may want these to scale in closer. And have this move down a little bit closer to the hand. But you can see now that the point of this rotating is still here, but it's easier to grab that control to move that joint because that's there. I'm going to duplicate this and make a few of them, and I'm going to line them up with each of the metacarpal joints. So we're going to need a few of these. And on that note, I'm also going to need to adjust some of their shapes. Again, I'm just grabbing the points because I don't want to move the axis. I just want to move where the control is located visually. If at any point you feel like it's hard to see your splines, you can change their color in your preferences. We can click on scheme colors, and then we can find our spline. So within the viewport here, we can see spline start and spline end. I'm going to change these to something that's easier to see. Like now you can see the start is bright red, and then the end could be green. No, green looks too close to the color of the bones. Let's try yellow. So now you can see that's a lot easier to see these, and I think that's helpful. And that goes for when they're selected. There's many different ways to rig or create controls. I think that this is something that intimidates a lot of people, but once you realize that you just need to rig something to the extent in which you're using it, it makes it less intimidating. I know that's something that EJ Hassenfratz has said before, that you don't need to make a complicated rig. You just need to make it work for whatever you need to do. And that could be simple. You don't need to make something more complicated than what it needs to be. So this is our thumb metacarpal. I'm going to name it as such. So at this point, we have the elbow control and the wrist control. Just to show you exactly how these controls will work, I'm going to right click on the elbow. I'm going to go to rigging tags, and then I will select a constraint tag. Once I do that, I'll select transform. And for the target, we're going to choose our elbow control. So I'll drag and drop this in here. Now we have an elbow control in here, which is lovely to see. When I move the elbow control, it will make it easier to move the elbow joint. So you can see one controls the other. So sometimes it's hard to click on the joint in here, and that's why we add these here, so that I can select the joint by selecting the control. In order to have a little bit of a shortcut in terms of adding in the controls after the metacarpals that we added in, I'm going to select all of these. I'll hold Control and I'll select the circle. And you can see that automatically added circles to all of those. I'll reduce the size to something smaller. You can see here at this point, these controls that were added, or these circles that were added, we're going to use them as controls soon. And now that I've done that, I can go ahead and select these 3 or 4 circles, hold down Shift-C, go over to our naming tool. We're going to change circle, replace circle with pinky control in our naming, and press replace name. Now all of these have been changed to pinky control. I'm going to now fix the hierarchy and drop these where they need to go, like that. I can select all of these, and similar to how our pinky joints are under the pinky metacarpal hair, we need these to go under that control. The pinky metacarpal control needs to have these pinky controls under it. And the reason why I had added these initially under these joints is because it automatically centers them and it saves me time. It automatically, when you add a child underneath a parent holding control while adding in an object, it'll automatically make that in the same location as the parent. And that is why these line up so nicely. And it's a great foolproof way to add in controls. Now in here, I'm going to quickly name these. This is our pinky proximal control, pinky middle control, pinky distal, and then this is our pinky end control. We don't really need the pinky end control now that I'm thinking about it, but it doesn't really hurt to have it there. I'll just leave it there for now. Now I'm going to go ahead and add these in for the rest of the fingers real quick. Now that I have all of these in place for our controls, I can make some further adjustments to their shape if I'd like to. And then I'm going to do the same thing as I did before with this constraint. And I'm going to add constraints for the rest of the joints and have them reference these controls as targets. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to speed it up a little bit since the process is the same as we had just shown before. So I'll go ahead and do that now. I realized that I added in more controls than what I needed when I was automatically adding them by selecting all the joints. I don't really need them for the end since the end won't be used to bend anything or control anything else next in the hierarchy since it's at the end of the chain of joints. So I'm just going ahead and removing it here. So that's an overview of setting up the controls and the joints for our rig. Next time we'll go over how to weight the individual points of our geometry so that the mesh will move with the joints. And we will go over that next time. I hope to see you then. If you'd like to be notified when more of these come out, please hit subscribe and hit the bell. If you'd like to give me a thanks and help support my YouTube, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi if you find any of these tips helpful. I hope to see you again here next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to 3D model and rig with me.